The shooting. I love that stuff, the killing.
A lot of killing.
Tarantino's career is full of iconic violence, exploding gunfights, razor-sharp dialogues, unforgettable bloodbaths. And don't get me wrong, I love that stuff. But perhaps his most sophisticated use of suspense isn't the one ends in a thunderous shootout at all. In fact, it barely uses violence. I'm talking about Spahn Ranch sequence from the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. A scene Tarantino himself has said is one of his favorites. And also the one that might just be the closest thing we'll ever get to a horror movie directed by him. Because if the entire film is a love letter to the twilight of Hollywood's golden era, an almost idealized fantasy of bygone time, then this scene is its opposite. It's a doorway into Tarantino's nightmare. A place where we briefly leave nostalgia behind and step into Hollywood's darkest shadows. Before we get into what makes the scene so unsettling, we need context. Because the tension only works due to where we are in the story. At this point, our protagonists aren't any soldiers or gangsters. They are Rick Dalton, an actor, and his stunt double Cliff Booth. And what's interesting about these two is that their entire dynamic is built on illusion. Like Rick plays the tough guy in the movies, but Cliff is actually the tough guy. And we see this contrast very clearly just minutes before the Spahn Ranch sequence. Rick stars in a fictional western, confidently walking into the danger on a controlled set. And then the very next scene cuts to Cliff, driving in a real location that looks like western but feels deeply wrong. At some level, these two men represents the central tension of the film, reality versus fiction. And that tension is precisely what makes the Spahn Ranch scene work. And actually, this is where the fiction ends. When it was announced that Charles Manson would appear in the film, many assumed Tarantino would lean into the mythology. A charismatic monster, a larger-than-life embodiment of evil. Instead, Tarantino does something far more unsettling. When he introduces Manson, he avoids everything we expect. No grand entrance, no iconic framing. Manson is small, distant, and almost pathetic. Tarantino refuses to mythologize him, stripping away the cinematic power we are used to. But that's exactly what makes the ranch unsettling. The horror isn't Manson himself. It's the space he left behind. Spahn Ranch is only truly decayed location in the film. Everything else celebrates beauty, color, and glamour. Here, there is dirt, broken houses, and the most importantly, there is no score. Tarantino lets sound do all the work. Dogs barking, flies buzzing, crows echoing through the scene. All diegetic, all quietly telling us that something here is dead. Visually, the frames are unstable, tilted angles, awkward compositions. Nothing feels balanced. And what makes the tension unbearable is that Tarantino mirrors this scene with the western sequence that comes right before it. A hero enters dangerous territory, controlled by outlaws. But earlier it was fiction, and now it's real. Cliff Booth here feels like a movie hero who's wandered off the screen. A man who belongs in cinematic violence, now placed in a situation where violence has no rules. As Cliff moved deeper into the ranch, Tarantino stretches the suspense. We expect something horrible to happen, but actually nothing does. Again and again Tarantino builds expectation only to deny the release. The suspense is stretched like a rubber band just to see how far it can go. And when Cliff insists on seeing George Spahn, the scene briefly turns into a horror film. The house is dark, the sound grows oppressive, and then the tension collapses. George isn't a hostage, he isn't murdered. He's just old, blind, decaying, a man who once ran a thriving movie ranch, now unable to even watch television. In that moment, the scene stops being about fear and becomes about loss. The death of an era. Hollywood moving on and leaving people behind. And just when we think the scene is over, Tarantino reactivates the danger one last time. But now the tone changes. The fear gives way to release. When Cliff finally fights back, the violence feels earned, cathartic. This isn't just violence for shock, it's violence as fantasy. The same fantasy Tarantino uses at the end of the film involving Sharon Tate. He isn't erasing history, he's rewriting it. Turning some painful memory into something cinematic. Turning a memory into an art. And that's why the Spahn Ranch scene works so well. Nothing happens until everything means something.